They laughed before she even touched the file. The sound rolled across the private dining room in warm waves of polished arrogance, bouncing off crystal glasses, dark walnut walls, and a 20-foot ceiling painted in old money silence. Naomi Carter stood beside the long mahogany table in a black server's uniform, one hand still resting on a silver water pitcher, while 12 executives in tailored suits watched her with amused disbelief. It had started when she reached toward the leather folder left half open beside Richard Whitmore's elbow. "Careful," one man muttered with a smirk, "the help might start practicing law." A ripple of laughter followed. Richard leaned back in his chair, silver cuff links catching chandelier light, his smile slow and cutting. "Go ahead," he said. "Open it. Entertain us." Naomi's fingers paused over the legal file, but her face did not change. Calm had always been her armor. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glowed through a winter drizzle, headlights dragging gold through wet streets 27 stories below. Inside, the room smelled of cedar, espresso, and power. Naomi opened the file. The laughter grew louder. To them she was a waitress carrying sparkling water at a billion-dollar merger dinner, a black woman in soft-soled shoes who was meant to pour, disappear, and never interrupt. But Naomi's eyes moved over the pages with unsettling precision. A paragraph. Then another. Her breathing slowed. Something was wrong. Very wrong. She turned one page farther. The room continued joking around her. Someone ordered more bourbon. Another checked his watch. Richard Whitmore watched her as if indulging a child. He had the polished confidence of a man who had never been contradicted by anyone beneath his station. White-haired, Harvard-made, and famous for swallowing companies whole, he wore control like another tailored layer. Naomi lifted her head. "This isn't a merger safeguard," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a dropped glass. The laughter stumbled. Richard blinked once, then smiled wider. "Excuse me." Naomi placed one finger on a paragraph near the bottom of the page. "This indemnity clause transfers criminal liability to your own board." A silence flickered and vanished as several men chuckled again, harder this time. "And our waitress reviews white-collar risk now," someone said. Naomi didn't react. She kept looking at Richard. "If this executes, whoever signs becomes the fall guy." Richard's smile cooled. "Close the file," he said, almost amused. "Before you embarrass yourself." But Naomi did not move. Something in her stillness unsettled the room more than argument would have. Because she wasn't guessing. She was certain. The chandelier light shimmered over the contract paper as she turned to page 43. Her hand did not shake. "Read this line aloud," she said. No one laughed now, but no one obeyed. For a beat only the rain tapped the windows. Richard leaned forward, the first crack of irritation entering his voice. "You're a server." Naomi met his stare. "And you're about to sign your own indictment." The words landed like iron. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a younger partner reached instinctively for the document. Richard stopped him with a raised hand, but too late, something had shifted. What began as mockery had become a room waiting to breathe. And Richard Whitmore, who had entered the night certain he controlled every soul at the table, suddenly noticed something colder than challenge in Naomi Carter's eyes. Recognition. As if she knew something about the file, and about him. Then Naomi turned one more page, touched a hidden annex buried behind the merger terms, and said 5 words that made every face go pale. "This file isn't about them." She looked directly at Richard. "It's about you." The silence held so long it began to feel physical, pressing against the polished walls, settling into the seams of expensive suits. No one reached for a drink. No one smiled. Richard Whitmore stared at Naomi as though the room had tilted beneath him. Then he gave a quiet laugh, too measured to be natural. "You are playing a dangerous little game," he said. But Naomi had already turned the file toward the younger partner at the far end of the table, a man named Daniel Reeves whose hands hesitated before touching the paper. "Read the annex footer," she said. Daniel adjusted his glasses, leaned toward the page, and his brow tightened. The room watched his face change before anyone heard the words. "Asset shielding through offshore subsidiary transfer," he stopped. Swallowed. Looked again. "This references Whitmore Strategic Holdings." A pulse of murmurs moved through the room. Richard's jaw hardened. That annex was not included in the final draft. Naomi answered before anyone else could. It was hidden behind a renumbered liability section. Her voice stayed even, but memory moved behind it now, older than this room, older than this night. For months Naomi had carried trays through private dinners at the Astor Club while men like these mistook service for invisibility. They talked in front of her as if she were furniture. She remembered collecting untouched bourbon glasses after midnight while listening to fragments of mergers, shell companies, audit freezes. She remembered scribbling phrases on napkins in the service corridor because something in her would not let patterns go. Before the bills, before her mother's chemo, before life narrowed into double shifts and aching feet, Naomi Carter had been 2 semesters from a law degree. She still kept her constitutional law casebook in a cardboard box beneath her apartment radiator in Queens. Some nights after a 12-hour shift, she opened it and read by kitchen light while the steam pipes rattled. That old discipline had never died. It had gone quiet. That was different. Richard rose slowly from his chair. The movement itself seemed to warn the room. "This meeting is over." But Daniel did not release the document. Another director leaned in. Then another. The silence fractured into overlapping whispers. Who inserted this? Was compliance informed? This cannot be authentic. Naomi looked only at Richard. You asked me not to embarrass myself. Her tone held no triumph. Only fact. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. Who gave you this file? It was almost a hiss. Naomi felt the old instinct to shrink, the one poverty teaches, the one prejudice reinforces. But she had crossed too far now. You did, she said. You left it open. A strange stillness moved over Richard's face, as if calculation was racing behind his eyes. Then from the far end of the table, Daniel spoke again, quieter now. There are transfer signatures attached. He looked up. Signed authorization requests. The words seemed to drain heat from the room. One woman from corporate counsel pushed back her chair. Richard, what exactly is this? No one called him Mr. Whitmore anymore. Naomi noticed that. Power had a sound when it slipped, and sometimes it sounded like titles disappearing. Rain tapped harder against the windows. A siren moved faintly below on Lexington Avenue. Richard reached for the file, but Daniel did not let go. For one suspended second, 2 men held the same paper from opposite ends, one protecting status, the other protecting truth. Naomi saw something then she had not expected. Fear. Not anger. Fear. Richard released the page. Smoothed his cuff. Forced composure over panic. You have all been manipulated by a waitress with fantasies of relevance. But even he heard the weakness in it. Because the room was no longer looking at Naomi as staff. They were looking at her as witness. And as Naomi stepped back from the table, fingers brushing the silver water pitcher she had nearly forgotten she carried, she knew this was no longer about a contract. It was about whether powerful men would dare read what had always been in front of them. Then the private dining room doors opened softly, and a gray-haired compliance officer no one had invited stepped inside holding a thin federal envelope with Richard Whitmore's name on it. No one moved when the compliance officer entered, yet the entire room seemed to recoil. He was an older man in a charcoal suit with rain still glistening on his overcoat shoulders, the kind of man whose quiet presence carried more authority than raised voices ever could. In his hand was a federal envelope, cream-colored, sealed, deliberate. The gold lamplight caught the edge of it as he stepped to the table. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "This cannot wait." Richard Whitmore's expression did not fully break, but something in his posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly, as if every muscle had been ordered not to betray him. "This is a private meeting," Richard said. The compliance officer laid the envelope beside the legal file. "Not anymore." The word settled with a weight that made even the crystal glasses seem too fragile for the moment. Naomi stood near the service station, half in shadow now, watching the architecture of power rearrange itself. Daniel Reeves opened the envelope before Richard could stop him. The paper inside crackled in the silence. His eyes moved rapidly, then slowed. "Preliminary federal inquiry," he read, voice dry. "Review of undisclosed offshore exposure tied to Whitmore Strategic Holdings." No one spoke. Even the rain seemed to pull back. The woman from corporate counsel lowered herself into her chair as if her knees had forgotten certainty. Richard reached for control through tone. "This is procedural noise. Fishing expeditions happen." But no one nodded. Naomi could feel the room turning not through drama, but through tiny betrayals of confidence, a loosened tie, a diverted gaze, a pen set down too carefully. She had seen something similar years earlier in a Brooklyn courtroom gallery, watching a prosecutor dismantle a witness not by accusation, but by letting truth sit long enough to become undeniable. She had been 23 then, sitting in the back row between classes, believing she would spend her life in rooms like that. The memory flashed through her now with startling clarity, as if the life she had buried was leaning back toward her. Richard turned toward Naomi with a controlled smile that now looked almost brittle. "You planned this." Naomi shook her head. "I recognized it." The distinction landed harder than blame. Daniel was already comparing the annex signatures with the inquiry notice. "The dates align." Another executive whispered, "My God." Richard's hand flattened against the table, but he did not pound it, did not lose temper. That made him more dangerous. Or had, until now. Everyone here is overreacting to a server reading half a document. Then Naomi did something no one expected. She stepped closer to the table. Again. Not boldly. Quietly. As if drawn by obligation rather than courage. "It was not half a document," she said. "It was the only page that mattered." Her voice carried because no one interrupted. Daniel looked up at her differently now, not with surprise but with respect edged by regret. "How did you even see this?" Naomi almost smiled, though sadness touched it first. "Because people talk freely around those they think do not count." The room absorbed that. It was not only about Richard anymore. It was about every laugh when she opened the file. Every glance that had dismissed her before she spoke. The chandelier hummed softly overhead. Somewhere in the kitchen beyond the doors, dishes clinked in ordinary rhythm, absurdly normal against the unraveling in this room. Then the compliance officer cleared his throat and added, "There is one more matter." He withdrew a second document. This one thinner. Personal. He slid it toward Daniel instead of Richard. Anonymous supporting evidence was submitted 48 hours ago. Daniel unfolded it, frowned, then looked up sharply toward Naomi. "Submitted by who?" The officer answered without looking away from Richard Whitmore. "By an employee witness using the name N. Carter." A chill moved through the room. Richard turned fully toward Naomi now, disbelief breaking through composure at last. "You sent this before tonight?" Naomi held his gaze. "I sent it when I realized no one here was going to protect themselves." No one laughed this time. No one breathed loudly enough to disturb the moment. And as Richard slowly lowered himself back into his chair, staring at the woman he had mistaken for invisible, the old brass clock above the bar struck 9, each chime sounding less like time passing and more like something closing. The ninth chime faded into a silence so complete Naomi could hear the faint hiss of radiator pipes behind the walnut paneling. Richard Whitmore remained seated, but the stillness around him no longer resembled authority. It looked like containment. Daniel Reeves set the federal inquiry notice beside the annex and slowly removed his glasses, pressing a thumb to the bridge of his nose as though trying to steady a world that had shifted inches but felt miles. Then Richard spoke, softer than before, which unsettled the room more than anger would have. "You forged this crisis," he said to Naomi. "You planted evidence, provoked panic, and now you stand here pretending moral courage." His words were smooth, but they arrived too carefully, assembled rather than believed. Naomi felt every eye return to her. For the first time that night, pressure touched her chest. Not fear exactly. The old ache of being asked to prove she belonged in a room already judging her. She remembered scholarship interviews where professors smiled politely at her ambition. Court internships where people assumed she was administrative staff. The sting was old. But so was endurance. She answered without haste. If truth feels planted, maybe it is because lies were arranged too well. No one reacted immediately, yet several heads lowered toward the documents again. Richard rose once more, this time walking slowly around the table toward her. The polished floor carried each footstep with unnerving clarity. The room held its breath. He stopped 6 feet away. Close enough to confront, too far to intimidate physically, but the history of power sat between them. "Tell them," he said, voice low. "Tell them why someone with legal training serves cocktails." It was meant as humiliation dressed as inquiry. Naomi understood at once. Pull her biography into evidence. Turn survival into suspicion. For a second the old reflex whispered to retreat. Then Daniel surprised the room. "Counselor Whitmore," he said, using the title almost formally, "that line of attack is beneath this table." Richard turned, stunned more by the interruption than the words. Tiny fractures widened. Naomi felt something warm and painful move through her, not triumph but recognition that dignity can sometimes be defended by witnesses. "Still," she answered. "I left law school because my mother needed treatment and debt collectors do not honor potential." Her voice did not tremble. "I worked because survival could not wait for prestige." The corporate councilwoman looked at Naomi with eyes altered by shame. "And you still recognized what our entire review team missed." Naomi gave a small shrug. "I kept reading." It was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Richard's composure thinned. "You all are romanticizing a server who slipped into documents she had no right to touch." The compliance officer finally stepped closer. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, what concerns us is not how she saw the annex." He tapped page 43. "It is why it exists." Another silence. Harder now. Richard glanced toward the private doors as if calculating exits invisible to others. Then Naomi noticed something on the inquiry notice Daniel still held. A notation. She stepped nearer, reading upside down. "There is a witness interview request scheduled tomorrow." Daniel followed her gaze. "For internal participants." He looked at Richard. "That includes us." Suddenly the merger dinner was no longer a fortress of privilege but a room full of potential defendants. Anxiety moved openly now. One executive asked whether outside counsel should be retained. Another whispered about exposure. The hierarchy was dissolving into self-preservation. And Richard, sensing the tide turn, tried one final move. He looked at Naomi and smiled with old cold elegance. "Suppose I admit irregularities. Who do you think they will trust in the end? A managing partner or a waitress who breached confidentiality?" The cruelty in it was quieter than shouting and far sharper. Naomi absorbed it, then reached for the leather file and turned to the back pocket no one had touched. "They may decide that tomorrow," she said. "But tonight they can read this." She removed a folded handwritten memo. Old-fashioned, Blue ink, signed. Daniel took it, unfolded it, and his face drained. This is a side agreement. He looked up slowly. Signed by Richard alone. The room seemed to lean inward. Even Richard did not speak. Then from somewhere beyond the rain-dark glass, lightning flashed over the skyline, white and sudden, illuminating every face at once, and in that brief cold light Naomi saw what laughter had become, not silence now, but reckoning. Lightning faded, but the room did not recover its old shape. It felt smaller now, as if truth had consumed square footage. Daniel Reeves kept staring at the handwritten side agreement as though the ink itself might rearrange if he looked long enough. It did not. Richard Whitmore remained motionless, one hand resting against the chair back, the practiced confidence that once filled him now narrowed into calculation. Then the corporate councilwoman, Margaret Sloane, broke the silence. Did the board ever authorize this instrument? Her voice was precise, almost brittle. Richard answered too quickly. It was a contingency draft. Daniel looked up. Signed and dated 6 months ago. Each fact arrived like another lock turning. Naomi stood near the silver service cart, the untouched water glasses throwing fractured reflections across the polished table, and for the first time all evening she felt exhaustion brush the edge of adrenaline. Her feet ached inside worn black flats. Her shift had started at noon. It was nearing 10 at night. Yet the deeper weight was not physical. It was the realization that she had pushed events past recall. Whatever happened next could not be folded back into ordinary silence. Richard seemed to understand that too. He straightened his tie, a gesture almost ceremonial, and spoke with renewed control. This is being interpreted with reckless imagination. There are legal explanations. But no one reached to defend him. Even the younger analysts at the edge of the room had stopped pretending neutrality. Then Margaret said something no one expected. I want the minutes preserved. It sounded procedural, but everyone understood what it meant. This was no longer private embarrassment. It was record. Richard turned toward her, disbelief crossing his face. You would formalize this based on accusations from waitstaff? Margaret met his stare. Based on documents bearing your signature. The distinction cut clean. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by a strange grief she had not prepared for. She had imagined exposure, perhaps vindication. She had not imagined witnessing the collapse of a man built from prestige and intimidation. And somewhere beneath what he had done, she sensed a lonely ruin. That unsettled her more than his contempt ever had. The compliance officer gathered the inquiry papers. Given these disclosures, I advise suspension of execution on tonight's merger vote. A low murmur spread. Millions, perhaps billions, suddenly hung in pause because a waitress had opened a file. Daniel looked at Naomi again. When did you know? She answered honestly. Not until page 43. He almost laughed, but the sound broke into awe instead. Richard heard it. Something in him hardened one final time. You all think this is moral awakening, he said. It is theater. By morning this woman will be dismissed, and this room will remember how institutions actually work. The old arrogance returned, but thinner now, almost desperate. Naomi surprised herself by stepping toward him. Maybe, she said softly. But tomorrow those institutions will have to read. Even Richard had no immediate reply. Outside, the rain softened to a mist against the glass. The city below shimmered silver and amber, traffic flowing indifferent to scandal. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Daniel placed the side agreement back on the table and said, I move we notify independent counsel tonight. Another executive nodded. Then another. Consent gathered not dramatically but like stones placed one by one. Richard watched allies become distance. His shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly. Not defeat exactly. Recognition. Naomi saw his hand rest on the leather chair where he had presided all evening, fingers tracing the carved edge as if touching a thing already becoming memory. Then Margaret turned to Naomi. "Miss Carter," she said, and the honorific alone changed the air, "who taught you to read contracts like this?" Naomi hesitated, seeing in her mind her late mother asleep in a clinic chair while Naomi highlighted case law in waiting rooms. "Life," she answered. No one smiled, yet something warmer entered the silence. Then Daniel reopened the annex and froze at a notation in the margin none of them had noticed before. Handwritten initials. Not Richard's. Someone else inside the firm. He looked up slowly, face pale again. There is another name involved. And in an instant the reckoning everyone thought had reached its peak opened into something larger. The words hung in the room like frost. There is another name involved. Daniel Reeves did not repeat it, yet everyone leaned toward the margin as though the ink itself had begun whispering. Naomi watched his finger rest beside the handwritten initials, 2 letters pressed in blue ink near a redacted routing note. Ms. Margaret Sloane went still. So still Naomi could hear the faint scrape of her ring against the crystal stem she was unconsciously turning. Richard Whitmore looked not at Daniel, but at Margaret. And in that glance, years of concealed alliances seemed to flicker into view. No one accused her. No one needed to. The possibility alone altered the air. Margaret slowly stood, smoothing her jacket with hands that were steady only by discipline. "Those are my initials," she said. Her voice did not crack. Somehow that made it heavier. A collective silence answered. Daniel blinked as if refusing what he had heard. "You reviewed this annex?" Margaret looked toward the rain-dark windows before answering. "I flagged concerns months ago." She paused. "And I was persuaded to let it pass." The confession landed without spectacle, which made it devastating. Naomi felt no triumph. Only a deep, unexpected sadness. Corruption had seemed simpler when it wore one face. Human weakness was harder to hold. Richard spoke, but for the first time his voice carried fatigue. It was not coercion. Margaret turned toward him with a look Naomi could not forget, not hatred, not even anger, but sorrow sharpened by self-recognition. "No," she said quietly. "It was cowardice." The room fell into a different kind of silence now, not the suspense of revelation, but the hush that follows when people stop performing and begin seeing themselves. Even the compliance officer lowered his papers. Outside, the rain had thinned to drifting mist. Through the high windows, city lights blurred into halos. Naomi suddenly became aware of the silver pitcher still in her hand. She set it down softly. The tiny sound seemed enormous. Daniel eased back into his chair. "Then this is larger than one fraudulent transfer." Margaret nodded once. "Much larger." Richard looked older. In that moment, not physically, but in spirit, as if the architecture that had held him upright had begun dissolving. Naomi noticed his gaze drift toward the leather file, then toward her. Something had changed in it. Not surrender. Not yet. But the old contempt was gone. Replaced by something harder to name. Perhaps the beginning of shame. No one spoke for several long breaths. The brass clock ticked over the bar, each second deliberate. Naomi remembered sitting as a girl in a church after funerals, when conversation would stop and only old wood settling could be heard. This silence felt like that. A mourning for illusions. Daniel folded the annex closed. "We suspend the merger. We notify independent counsel. We cooperate with inquiry." No one objected. The vote passed almost without words. Quiet justice often arrives that way. Margaret then did something no one expected. She looked directly at Naomi and said, "I laughed when you opened the file." Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "I was wrong." Naomi felt the apology enter her more painfully than insult had. Because dignity, once denied and then acknowledged, carries weight. She answered only, "You looked again." It was enough. Richard lowered himself into his chair and stared at his own hands. For a long while he said nothing. Then, barely audible, he asked Naomi, "Why did you not walk away?" The question held no strategy now. Only bewilderment. Naomi thought of debt notices, hospital corridors, law books under a radiator, all the years people assumed silence was her natural place. She answered with the simplest truth she had. Because someone had to stay in the room. Richard closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had softened, almost imperceptibly. Yet before anyone could speak again, the compliance officer checked his phone, frowned, and lifted his head. "There is an issue." The room tensed. "Federal investigators are downstairs." A pause. Then he added, "And they are asking for Naomi Carter by name." The word struck the room harder than any accusation had. "Federal investigators are downstairs. And they are asking for Naomi Carter by name." For one suspended second Naomi thought. She had misheard. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the service cart. All evening she had imagined inquiry as paper, signatures, maybe testimony weeks away. Not elevators opening tonight. Not agents waiting below. Daniel rose so quickly his chair brushed the carpet with a dull scrape. "As a witness?" he asked. The compliance officer checked the message again. "That appears to be the indication." But uncertainty lingered in the pause after appears. Naomi felt her pulse in her throat. Every old fear rushed back at once, the familiar suspicion that systems notice people like her only when blame is needed. Richard Whitmore saw it cross her face. Something changed in him then with startling speed. He stood, not as a man reclaiming command, but as one making a decision against his own interest. "She does not go down there alone," he said. The room turned. Even Naomi stared. Daniel looked almost startled into respect. "You would accompany her?" Richard answered without flourish. "I created enough silence around truth already." The words did not erase what he had done, but they landed with the gravity of someone hearing himself honestly perhaps for the first time in years. Margaret Sloane stepped forward. "I will go too." Suddenly what had been a room of fracture carried the faint shape of conscience. Naomi did not know what to make of it. The compliance officer nodded once and led them toward the private elevator beyond the bar. As they crossed the dining room, the chandelier light trailed over polished glass and abandoned legal drafts, over half-finished bourbon and signatures no one would execute. It looked like a battlefield after no violence, only revelation. The elevator doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh. Inside, mirrored walls reflected four people who an hour earlier had occupied different moral worlds. Now they descended together. 27 floors. 26. 25. The numbers glowed amber above the doors. No one spoke at first. Then Richard said quietly, eyes on the floor indicator, "When I was a first-year associate, I believed law was a shield for the vulnerable." Naomi looked at him, uncertain whether the confession was for her or for himself. "What happened?" she asked before she could stop herself. A faint sad smile crossed his face. "Success." The elevator hummed downward. At 15, Margaret whispered, almost to no one, "We all begin with ideals we think money cannot reach." At 12, Daniel exhaled. And then one waitress reopens the file. It was the first thing anyone had said all night that held the edge of wonder. At lobby level the doors parted. Marble floors stretched beneath vaulted ceilings. Security guards stood aside. Two federal investigators waited near the reception desk, one woman in a navy suit, one older man carrying a binder. Neither looked hostile. The woman stepped forward. "Miss Carter?" Naomi nodded. Her voice almost failed. "Yes." The investigator's expression softened unexpectedly. "Thank you for coming down." She extended a folder. We requested you because the anonymous supporting evidence you submitted included forensic notes our office had missed. Naomi blinked. I am not a forensic analyst. The woman gave the faintest smile. Tonight you were. Daniel actually laughed once under his breath in disbelief. Richard stood beside Naomi, silent. Then the older investigator turned to him. Mr. Whitmore, counsel will need to speak with you as well. A shadow crossed his face, but he did not resist. Instead he looked at Naomi. For a moment the marble lobby, the agents, the tower itself seemed to fall away. You saved people in that room, he said quietly. Including me from becoming less than I already was. Naomi did not answer. She only held his gaze, seeing not the man who mocked a waitress, but a human being standing inside the ruins of his own certainty. Then the woman investigator opened Naomi's folder to a page clipped with yellow tabs and said, there is something else you need to see. At the top of the document, under proposed witness status, was a handwritten note from the United States Attorney. Recommend immediate legal fellowship offer for Naomi Carter. Naomi read the handwritten note once, then again, as if the words might dissolve under fluorescent lobby light. Recommend immediate legal fellowship offer for Naomi Carter. The page trembled slightly in her hands, though whether from fatigue or disbelief she could not tell. For years possibility had been something she folded away to make room for rent, prescriptions, subway fare. Now it sat before her in government stationery. Daniel leaned closer, reading over her shoulder, and gave a slow breath of astonishment. They are offering you a way back. Naomi almost smiled, but emotion caught before it became visible. The female investigator, whose badge read Elena Morales, closed the folder gently. Not a gift, she said. Recognition. The distinction settled deep. Richard Whitmore stood very still, looking at the folder as if witnessing a verdict larger than any inquiry. Then, to Naomi's surprise, he removed a gold fountain pen from his jacket pocket and held it toward her. I used this to sign every major deal of my career. He paused, the marble lobby quiet around them. If there is any decency left in symbolism, use it for better things. No one moved. Even the security guard seemed held by the moment. Naomi hesitated before accepting it. The pen felt unexpectedly warm from his hand. I do not need your pen to become a lawyer, she said softly. Richard gave a faint nod. No. But perhaps I need to give away the things that taught me the wrong lessons. It was not absolution. It was something smaller and perhaps more honest. The investigators stepped aside to take calls, leaving the four of them near the broad reception windows where rainwater still traced silver lines down the glass. Outside, midnight traffic glowed red and gold. Margaret Sloane folded her arms against a sudden chill. If you accept the fellowship, she said, you will need recommendations. Naomi looked at her, uncertain. Margaret continued, almost with quiet urgency, mine will be first. Daniel added, and mine. The offers did not feel transactional. They felt reparative. Naomi looked down at the fountain pen in one hand, the fellowship note in the other, and thought of her mother reading eviction letters under dim kitchen light, always saying dignity is what you carry when nobody hands you a seat. For a moment grief and gratitude blurred together. Then Richard spoke again. Voice lower than before. There is something I must ask before tonight ends. Naomi turned. He held her gaze without defense now. Do you hate me? The question was so naked in its simplicity it emptied the air around it. Naomi considered the man who had laughed when she touched a file, the man who had nearly signed away others, and the man standing before her now stripped of polish. She answered with the truth that surprised even her. No, Richard's jaw tightened, not from resistance but relief too painful to hide. Why? He whispered. Naomi glanced toward the wet city beyond the glass. Because if I carried hatred into every room I entered, I would have become what tried to diminish me. Margaret looked away, blinking hard. Even Daniel seemed unable to speak. Richard lowered his head once, a gesture almost like reverence. Then Elena Morales returned, holding a business card. "Miss Carter, the Fellowship Committee Chair is awake and expecting a call tonight if you wish." Naomi laughed softly, the first real lightness of the night. "Tonight?" Elena smiled. "Justice keeps strange hours." They all stood there a moment longer, not as enemies and allies, but as people altered by a truth none had planned to meet. Then Richard reached into his briefcase and removed a worn leather notebook. "There is one more thing," he said. "My personal case annotations from 20 years ago. Before ambition made me forget why I studied law." He handed it to Naomi. The cover was scuffed at the edges. "Used. Lived in. Real." Naomi opened the first page. In faded ink, a sentence was underlined twice. "The law has no soul unless courage lends it one." She looked up, stunned. But before she could speak, an elevator bell sounded across the lobby, and a gray-haired man in a federal judge's overcoat stepped out, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Naomi Carter. The gray-haired judge did not hurry. He crossed the marble lobby with the calm of someone who had spent a lifetime entering rooms where truth arrived late but still arrived. His overcoat carried traces of rain, tiny silver droplets melting under warm lobby light. He stopped before Naomi Carter, looked at the fellowship note in her hand, then at the worn leather notebook Richard had given her, and gave the smallest nod, almost ceremonial. No introduction seemed necessary. Something in the silence recognized itself. He touched Naomi's shoulder only for a moment, light as breath, then passed Elena Morales a folded card and moved toward the elevators again. Nothing dramatic followed. No speeches. No proclamations. Only the soft bell of the elevator doors closing behind him, and the sound lingered longer than it should have. Naomi stood near the reception windows while the others slowly drifted apart into their own thoughts. Daniel was speaking quietly with investigators. Margaret sat alone on a leather bench, hands folded, looking older but strangely lighter. Richard remained near a marble column, not commanding space now, only occupying it. His tie was loosened. His shoulders had lowered. The city beyond the glass moved in endless ribbons of light, indifferent and beautiful. Naomi opened the leather notebook again. Her fingers traced the underlined sentence once more, then closed it gently. In the reflection on the window she saw herself holding a government folder in one hand and a waiter's service towel still tucked at her waist, both worlds visible at once. That made her smile, though only slightly. Somewhere a ventilation current stirred warm air across the lobby floor. The scent of rain and old paper lingered. Richard walked over at last, but stopped several feet away. He did not ask forgiveness again. He only placed his access badge from the law firm on the reception desk and left it there. Plastic, silver strip, his name embossed in black. A small object. Yet it seemed to weigh more than the building. Naomi watched him do it. He gave a quiet nod and stepped back, not toward power but away from it. For a moment no one moved. Then Margaret rose and without a word stood beside Naomi at the glass. Two women once separated by status now watching the same wet avenue below. Headlights flowed through puddled streets like strands of molten gold. Somewhere far down Lexington a siren faded into distance. Midnight had softened into the hour when cities exhale. Naomi slipped the gold fountain pen into her coat pocket. The motion was simple, almost invisible, but it felt like sealing something. She thought of the long subway ride home still ahead, of a radiator hissing in a small Queens apartment, of casebooks waiting under dust, of a mother no longer alive to see this night. Her chest rose and fell slowly. Breath clouded faintly on the cold edge of glass. Richard looked once more toward her reflection and then lowered his eyes, as if understanding some lessons could only be learned after losing the authority that once concealed them. No one spoke. There was nothing left language could improve. Daniel eventually turned off the conference room lights upstairs from a control panel in the lobby, and through the high atrium glass Naomi saw one floor go dark, then another, until the tower itself seemed to release the night back to itself. She rested her hand on the notebook. Warmth from her palms softened the worn leather. Outside, dawn had not arrived, but the black sky over the river had begun turning the faintest shade lighter. Not sunrise yet. Only promise. Naomi stood there while traffic moved, rain thinned, breath steadied. In the polished marble beneath them, for reflections held for a moment in silence before footsteps slowly dispersed. And in that quiet, where laughter had once echoed, only the soft sound of a woman remaining in the room could be heard.